In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of using the modified topics playbook in the Kafka operations repository to add and remove topics from an existing Kafka cluster. This playbook does not actually create a Kafka cluster. It's just used to add and remove topics from a cluster that's already up and running. In the background here, you can see that we do have an existing Zookeeper ensemble that's up and running. We've already deployed that, and we've already deployed a Kafka cluster where the nodes in this cluster are using this Zookeeper ensemble to discover the other nodes in the cluster and to elect a leader. Just to prove to you that the Kafka cluster is up and running, let's go ahead and SSH into one of those nodes. And from this window, let's go ahead and first discover what the Zookeeper nodes are that we're using. So let's just grep zoo from etc Kafka server properties. This is actually the Zookeeper connect string that's being used. So let's get a list of our Kafka topics using that string. And you can see that this is up and running with the logs and metrics topics actually allocated. And if you look at the /data directory, you can see that there is a metrics and a logs directory here. Looks like we've got at least 2 partitions for each. There may be more partitions that do not appear on this node. There are 3 nodes in this cluster, so the partitions do get distributed across them. So I've got a Kafka cluster that's up and running. Now what I want to do is add a couple of more topics to the cluster. As is the case with the other playbooks that we've already shown you, there is a variables file here that's actually fairly simple. It talks about the Kafka distribution, which needs to match the distribution that you deployed. It talks about the Kafka data directory. Again, needs to match where you told the Kafka cluster to place its data. And this is used when backing up topics, when we're deleting topics from the cluster. It's an operation you probably won't use much, but it is supported by this modify topics playbook. The group and user are important in terms of some of the commands that we run. Again, the private key path defaults to the playbook directory. The REST port is the port that the REST API for Kafka is running at, and it needs to match for connectors. That's used in this modified connectors playbook, and we'll get into that in a future video. So this REST port is actually not used for modifying topics, it's used for modifying connectors. And it's similar for the group and user. It's more for the modified connectors playbook than for the modified topics playbook. And there's a schema registry port. Again, this is important when we are supporting connectors that manage their state using the schema registry. So for the modify topics command, really the most important parameter here is the Kafka distro and this Kafka data dir. The Kafka dir is important for some of the commands that we're running if you've deployed the Apache Kafka distribution. Keep in mind that this Kafka operations playbook, and especially the modified connectors playbook within the Kafka operations repository, it is really only tested currently under Confluent. If you're going to try to modify connectors using the Apache Kafka distribution, your mileage may vary and you may have to do some additional work in order to add the connector framework to it. Again, that's a topic for a future video, but I thought I'd mention it here just in case. For modify topics, for the playbook we're going to run through here, it should support both Apache and Confluent, although most of our testing has been done using the open source Confluent distribution of Kafka. The playbook itself is going to look very similar to those of you who may have gone through our previous videos. In this case, there's a play at the beginning that creates the Kafka and Zookeeper host groups. In this case, it does not actually allocate any new nodes. So you don't see the AWS or OSP roles being used here. It looks for Kafka and Zookeeper, and if it does not find an instance or a cluster for Kafka, then it fails. It then goes through and loads the Zookeeper host group. And the assumption here is we don't really have to make any tests up here about Zookeeper, because the Kafka cluster would not have been deployed if there wasn't an associated Zookeeper instance or ensemble. So it'll gather the facts for that Zookeeper host group. Those facts are important for some of the Zookeeper commands we use when we're deleting topics from the repository, from the Kafka cluster rather. And then we go ahead and run through a final play that actually configures the Kafka topics that'll either add or delete topics. And this structure should look very similar to any of you who've been through our other videos. It does a little bit of work to gather some to include the Kafka operations variables file. It sets a couple of variables based on the host groups that we use later in the play. It initializes the play. It pulls out the important facts about the IP addresses of the Zookeeper nodes on the data network, the internal subnet, and then it calls a modify topics role, looping through all of the items in the action list, and I'll show you that in a moment. As is the case with all the other playbooks, there is a default configuration file that's loaded, and that default configuration file again should look very similar to those of you who've gone through our other playbooks. The only real difference here is that we do have an action list. The default action list is empty. And I'll walk you through an example of what the action list should look like if we're adding or removing topics here shortly. So the first thing I need to do is I need to come up with a custom configuration for adding my topics. So I'll go ahead and duplicate this file, and just for argument's sake, I'll call it config create topics. Now, as was the case in the other playbooks that I demonstrated, we need to set up our data flow to pipeline and our cluster to A in order to match the other playbooks. I'm also going to demonstrate here how we can use a separate directory to manage our private keys. So I'm going to go ahead, and all of our keys are going to be over here in temp key files. And I can show you that in a second. And then I need to add some actions to the action list. And for now, I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste my action list from another window on another desktop that you can't see. I'm going to walk you through what this action list is. The action list is, as the name implies, a list of actions. Each entry in the action list must have an action defined for it. These entries are actually dictionaries. And for the create topics action, I need to pass in a topics list that includes a second list of dictionaries. So I've got a list of dictionaries that are the actions that I'd like to take during this playbook run. For the modify topics playbook, the actions that are supported are to create topics or to delete topics. The topics list must have, for creating a topics, a name and can have a replication factor and a number of partitions. If you don't specify these two parameters, there are reasonable defaults that are assumed. I think the replication factor that's assumed by default is 1, and the number of partitions that are assumed are the number of elements in the Kafka cluster, the number of nodes in the Kafka cluster. But I'd have to check the code to verify that. But the name must be specified, and it needs to be a name that doesn't already exist for the topic. So this will actually just create two topics, test 1 and test 2, each with a replication factor of 2, the first with 5 partitions and the second with 10. If I save that, then I can go ahead and I can run my my modify topics playbook, and I'm going to go ahead and say for my config file, config create topics. And this should go through the process of discovering the Kafka and Zookeeper nodes, and then create those two topics, test 1 and test 2, on those nodes. It's a relatively quick process. You can see here that it's adding the topics on the 10.10.1.100 node. I only have to run that once. If I SSH back into the 188 node using the key file, and I run my Kafka topics list command now, you can see that I've got two new topics listed here, test 1 and test 2. And if I look at my data Kafka subdirectory, you can see that I've got a bunch of test 1 and test 2 directories out here. If I were to run the same, let's go ahead and sort. Let's go ahead and run the command to list that data Kafka subdirectory and grep out the test 1 and 2 subdirectories and then sort them for each of the nodes in my cluster. So I need to change the IP addresses here to reflect the IP addresses in my Kafka cluster. So 100 and 138, or 188 rather. And the third node in my Kafka cluster is 72. And you can see that I have 3 partitions of the 5 for test 1 here in the first node. I have 3 partitions of the 5 for test 1 in the second node. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4 partitions of the 5 for test 1 on the third node of my cluster. And similarly, I have some of the partitions out of the 10 or so that I've created here for test 2. I have a different set for the second node and a different set for the third node. So I've actually created my my topics, and the topics are distributed across the cluster with some of the partitions appearing on each of the nodes of the cluster. So if any one node goes down, I should have copies of that partition on at least one other node in my cluster. That's the strategy that's taken by Kafka in terms of maintaining the partitions across the clusters for the various replicas. So each of the nodes, or each of the partitions, is replicated twice. Once you can see 0 here and here for test 1. You can see 1 here and here for test 1, partition 1. You can see partition 4 appears here and here, but 3 and 2 are both on the third and second nodes. You get the idea. So I've created my topics. I promised you that there was the ability to delete topics as well. To do that, I need to create a slightly different configuration file, one with a different action. So let's go ahead and duplicate this one, and let's for the moment, I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this to delete. And then I'm going to change my action to reflect the delete topics action instead of the create topics action. And I'll walk you through what this actually looks like. I got to get the indentation right on this because this is YAML. So my action list again is a list of actions. In this case I have one action. That action is to delete topics. I need to pass in the names of the topics I would like to delete. Part of the deletion process involves actually SSHing into the Zookeeper ensemble and removing the metadata associated with these topics from Zookeeper. And so I need to actually give it the remote Zookeeper directory, the Zookeeper dir that was used when the Zookeeper ensemble was created. So this value needs to be the same value that was used for the Zookeeper dir parameter when I created my Zookeeper ensemble. And that helps it find the appropriate command, the Zookeeper zkcli.sh command, in order to be able to execute that. And then there's an optional flag here that says I'd like to back up the topic directories on my Kafka nodes before they're deleted. If this is not set, then the topic directories will be deleted and all the information in them would be removed and there would be no backup. And when I say backup, it actually creates a gzipped tar file for each of the topics on each of the nodes and leaves them in the /data/Kafka subdirectory. So go ahead and save that, and we'll go ahead and rerun our modified topic. And I'll change this from create to delete. So this will use the delete topics config file, which has the new action list with the new action to delete topics. And this will do a little bit of work to gather information about our nodes. And it's going to go ahead and find the Kafka topics command, remove the topics from the cluster, then go and remove the topics from, it's got to stop the service on each node independently. And on the first one, it'll go remove the metadata from Zookeeper. So you can see this is going through the first node. And then we iterate over all the nodes to remove all the matching directories. Go out to the remote Zookeeper ensemble and remove the metadata from there. Wait for 5 seconds so that Kafka has a chance to start up, and then we go to the next node in the cluster. Stop the service there, back up the metadata on that node, remove the appropriate directories in the /data/Kafka for that topic, and then move on to the next node in the cluster after starting it back up again. And this is an operation you probably won't do much, but it is supported by the playbook, and we wanted to demonstrate that you can go through this process and remove the appropriate metadata for the appropriate topics from a Kafka cluster. And we're going through the third node in the cluster now. And we're done. So if I bring back up this command, this is going to SSH into each of the nodes in turn and look in the /data/Kafka directory for the test1.2 files. And you can see that there's now an archive that's time-stamped for each of the topics that contains the metadata that existed on that node. So this set of archive files has all of the metadata from all of the directories, the log file directories that we removed on all of these nodes. And if I SSH back into the 188 node, and I go back and rerun my Kafka topics command, you'll see that the test1 and test2 logs, or the test1 and test2 topics are gone. And if I look at one of those, test1 archives, you'll see that there is a log, time frame, and index file for each of those subdirectories, along with the leader epic checkpoint. So all the metadata exists in these files, but we haven't really figured out what you would like to do with them. And like I said, by default, I don't think these are actually created. The default is to actually just remove the metadata without backing it up. But there should be enough metadata here to reinstantiate those topics if you were so inclined. We'll leave that as an exercise to the reader. So that's the basic demo for the Modified Topics playbook. Hopefully you found this useful, and we'll be talking again soon. Thanks.